This series begins with a young girl named Oh Young who has gone through a lot of tough times. She is set to inherit her family's business, but had to deal with her parents splitting up when she was little, which meant she hasn't seen her mom and older sister in 20 years. She also lost her sight because of an illness. And things got even worse when her dad got really sick and couldn't run the company anymore. So her fiancé, Young-ho, started taking over the business. However, Young didn't really trust her fiancé or his assistant, Mrs. Wang, especially when they tried to rush her into marrying Young-ho while her dad was very ill. She felt they just wanted to control the company. The only person she trusts is Mr. Jung, her dad's old friend and the company's lawyer. Young's brother, Oh-soo, has been out of touch too. He's been sending letters, but Young never got them because Mrs. Wang was hiding them. One day, Young discovers a letter from Oh-soo and rushes to the sender's address. Turns out, Oh-soo works as a waiter and stays with a friend who has the same name as him. Now let's talk about Oh-soo, who is Young's brother's best friend, but is also involved in some shady activities. He's known for being charming and can easily win over people's hearts, but he's not interested in settling down and starting a family. Turns out, Oh-soo had a tough childhood because his parents abandoned him when he was a kid. Despite his difficult past, he managed to become successful, even if it meant doing some not-so-honest things, like tricking a wealthy woman named Jin So-ra. One day, Young came to visit Oh-soo because her brother's letter led her to his place. Since her brother was at work, Oh-soo offered her a place to wait, but she declined and asked him to read the letter from her brother instead. The letter touched her because she was going to reunite with her brother after a long time. However, she got a call from the hospital, saying her father was in critical condition. Around the same time, Oh-soo was facing trouble because he was accused of stealing money from a nightclub. It turned out to be a trap set by So-ra to keep him in prison temporarily, thinking that he was planning to leave the country. At that time, Young's brother saw Oh-soo being chased by the police and tried to help, but sadly, he got hit by a car and died on the spot. Young didn't realize that her brother was injured so close to her. She had to rush home to see her father. On that very day, Mr. Oh also passed away, and so did his son, who was laid to rest without anyone knowing which family to contact. 1 year later, Oh-soo was released from prison because of the nightclub money case, but he still had a friend named Moo Chol who wanted his money back and was chasing him. In a stroke of luck, Mr. Jung found out where Young's brother lived. Interestingly, Oh-soo actually lived in the same small house that belonged to Young's brother. Since he had nowhere else to go, and because they shared the same name, there was a misunderstanding between Mr. Jung and Oh-soo. At that time, Mr. Jung thought that the troublemaker Oh-soo was Mr. Oh's only son. Realizing this, Oh-soo, who was in a tough spot, for some reason decided to admit that he was the Oh-soo Mr. Jung was looking for. Not wanting to start a big fuss, he asked Mr. Jung to leave and promised to meet him later. When his adopted brother, Jin Sung, showed up, Oh-soo got worried. He quickly brought him inside the house to keep him from talking too much and messing up his plans. Jin Sung didn't believe that the late Oh-soo was actually the son of a famous company owner, even though he initially thought it was just a joke. Despite the danger, they eventually decided to go undercover after checking some of Young's brother's belongings left in the house. At that time, a close friend of Jin Sung, named Hee-soon, also offered to help the two of them because she didn't want her friends to be in trouble for not being able to pay their debts within the next 3 months. The next day, Oh-soo rented a fancy car for a few months and pretended to be someone he wasn't. He also tried to find out more about Young's late brother when he was a kid, including details about his mom who had passed away. Meanwhile, Mr. Jung told Young that they could find Young's brother. When Young heard this, she didn't think Mrs. Wang would be happy to see her brother again. Mrs. Wang had been taking care of her for 20 years, even though she was his dad's girlfriend. But they were never married. She was in charge of the family's needs. Long story short, Oh-soo and his two friends planned to visit the PL Group company and meet Mr. Jung in the car company's parking lot. They'd almost had a collision with Young-ho's car. At that time, Jin Sung's emotional reaction worried Oh-soo because he thought the man might have an important position at the PL company. When they got home, Oh-soo started studying Young's brother's signature and made fake documents to pretend he owned a pizza restaurant. He soon even made a layout of Mr. Oh's family house to avoid confusion when they visited. Oh-soo realized he had met Young a year ago and thought she might be hard to fool, even though he couldn't see her. None of Young's family lived in Korea, so Oh-soo's plans went smoothly. When Oh-soo arrived at Mr. Oh's fancy family house, he seemed calm and didn't have any trouble handling Mrs. Wang's doubts about who he really was. It was a surprise and made him even more nervous when Yonko showed up and asked about the burns Oh-soo had when he was a child. Turns out the night before, Oh-soo purposely hurt his hand so that it would look like it had healed neatly in front of Young's family. Jin-sung intentionally spilled a drink on Oh-soo's clothes to make the scar more visible. To convince them, Oh-soo showed a special object that had belonged to Young's brother and was always placed on the piano. When Oh-soo arrived, Young still acted distant because she was disappointed that he hadn't come when their father was very sick a year ago. At that moment, Young explained that Oh-soo couldn't inherit any property without her approval. It wasn't easy to win her trust, let alone access the wealth. Young was hard to get close to, and she had always rejected Oh-soo. She believed to be her brother. At that time, she asked Oh-soo to leave many times because she was hurt that Oh-soo hadn't asked about her condition. She was now blind, but when they were separated, she could still see. That night, Oh-soo decided to stay at the house for 3 months to try and convince Young. He told a lie, saying that he would go to Italy after dealing with some family matters. During these 3 months, Oh-soo planned to gather some belongings and have to pay off his debts. Yong-ho wasn't quiet about it, cause he ordered his people to investigate the man who claimed to be Oh-soo and his background. Unexpectedly, Moo-kol came that night and gave Oh-soo a lesson on how to quickly pay off his debt. At that moment, Hee-seum didn't want Oh-soo to get hurt, so she said that Oh-soo was currently the son of the PL Group's owner, which meant he had a lot of money. On the other hand, while staying at the house that night, Oh-soo started trying to get closer to Young and asked for a heart-to-heart talk. He accidentally saw Young changing clothes, which made things even more awkward. However, Young always avoided Oh-soo, even during lunch. Then Oh-soo seemed to be trying a different approach to win Young's heart, rather than just being a warm and caring brother. However, he was pretending a bit because he thought that's how rich girls could be easily won over. When Oh-soo realized this, he tried to approach Young again, but she still refused to talk to him. Then, Oh-soo talked to Young about their different lifestyles. Oh-soo explained that he didn't care about money, but Young lived like a princess and got whatever she wanted. There he tried every day to convince Young, even though he kept failing, but he didn't give up. One day Oh-soo followed Young's daily routine, including a visit to a halfway house for the blind. Later, he intentionally asked for help from Young's friend Mi-ra. Unexpectedly, Young got scared when she lost her cane and ended up falling into a pool, because she didn't know where to go and no one was around to help her. Oh-soo saw the incident and quickly came to Young's aid, though she was a bit hesitant to accept his help. When they were at a train station, Moo-kol was seen watching Oh-soo, who was known for deceiving a rich person's daughter. When Mrs. Wang found out that Young was with Oh-soo, she panicked and scolded Mi-ra for not taking care of Young. Back at home, Young had no appetite because Mrs. Wang scolded her friend earlier. There, Mrs. Wang tried to explain how important her role was in Young's life. She had been with Young for 20 years, much longer than Young had been with her brother. Mrs. Wang's attitude of calling herself a guardian made Young uncomfortable. She said that guardians were like employees who could be replaced and fired at any time according to someone's wishes. In another place, Young was becoming uneasy about Oh-soo's presence because he believed that Oh-soo didn't genuinely love Young. However, Mr. Jung didn't seem to respond much, especially in Young's eyes, as he thought Mr. Jung was only interested in Young's wealth. While talking in her room, Young began to feel a bit suspicious about how Oh-soo spoke, as it sounded familiar. She even asked Oh-soo if he was the man she had met a year ago. At that time, Young found Oh-soo's habit of often gritting his teeth strange, because it seemed like he was carefully choosing his words. When Oh-soo tried to convince Young, at one point, she touched the burn scar on Oh-soo's hand. Young also declined a necklace from Oh-soo and asked for another item she had wanted since childhood. Oh-soo was confused because Young's real brother had passed away, so he couldn't ask someone who was no longer alive. Meanwhile, Jin-sung caught an employee taking Oh-soo's razor for Young-ho to use in a DNA test. Then, Oh-soo asked Jin-sung and Hee-seum for help to replace the razor with one that belonged to Young, which was still kept in her old house. While accompanying Young and Mi-ra for exercise, Oh-soo was approached by Moo-chol again, as if Moo-chol wanted his money back quickly, by any means necessary, even if it meant harming Young or taking her life. Hearing Oh-soo's reasons, Moo-chol was starting to believe that Oh-soo was beginning to sympathize with Young, who was blind. As Oh-soo was leaving, Mrs. Wang tried to search through his bag for his ID card, but she couldn't find anything unusual. Instead, she got caught by Oh-soo, who had previously set up a CCTV camera in his room. Realizing her actions were impolite, she quickly apologized to Oh-soo, even though she still had doubts about him. While walking alone in the snow, a neighbor named John Tae recognized Osu as his old friend. Of course, Osu had to act normally so that his disguise wouldn't seem suspicious. Back at the house, Young asked Mr. Jung to officially appoint Osu as her guardian. Hearing that, Mrs. Wang disagreed because she had always been the guardian, and the shareholders had supported her. Young then mentioned her father's suspicious death and the incomplete treatment for his brain tumor, which shocked Mrs. Wang even more. That night, Osu saw Young walking alone, heading to a greenhouse building. Inside, there were documents from when Young and her brother were kids, filled with happy memories. When Osu followed Young to that place, she became suspicious of his presence because she heard footsteps. The next day, Hee-soon and Jin-sung managed to switch the razors that were going to be examined by Young-ho. This way, the DNA test would show that Young and her brother had identical results. But that time, their secret surveillance was still safe because a cat distracted Young. At that time, Osu ended up trapped in the greenhouse because Young locked it from the outside. He called Hee-soon for help, and while waiting for her to arrive, Osu watched a video of Young's heartfelt confession. It turned out that decades ago, Mrs. Wang never once treated Young's illness when they were both in Japan. A little later, he soon arrived because the lock Young had used was easy to force open. He tore up a photo of Young and her brother when they were little, showing a scar on the left hand. This was different from the new wound that Osu had deliberately created on his right hand. On the other hand, he soon then shared how she had struggled to exchange Osu's razor with Young's brother, ensuring that Osu's true identity remained protected. The next day, Osu rang the bell on Young's bedroom window. He didn't know that Young was in the bathroom with a headache. Until now, she had kept her illness a secret and hadn't complained to anyone. At the same time, Osu asked Hee-soon to bring some flowers so they could plant them in the greenhouse, which was a hobby of Young's mother when she was alive. Meanwhile, in his office, Young-ho talked to Mrs. Wang about the doctor's suspicions regarding Osu's personal belongings, which seemed unused for the past 6 months. To get more accurate results, he planned to make Osu take a blood test, even though Mrs. Wang doubted that Osu would agree. Young-ho became suspicious when he read a letter from Young's brother several years ago, mentioning a friend with the same name. Later, Mrs. Wang met a business partner who turned out to be Jin So-ra, recently returned from America. During their conversation, So-ra received news about Osu's recent move. One day, Mira asked Osu for help to convince Young to attend a party at Jong Tae's shop. It turns out that Osu just found out that Jong Tae was the one who caused the burns on Young's brother's hand when they were kids. This incident made Jong Tae and Osu enemies since childhood, but Jong Tae remembered Osu's wound being on his left hand. At that time, Osu tried to convince Jong Tae that his memory was wrong, but Jong Tae started looking for old photos of them together in an album. Suddenly, Young-ho arrived to pick up Young for an event and asked Osu for permission because he planned to marry Young soon. He also requested Osu to leave Young's house right away because he felt uncomfortable with Osu being there. So Osu decided to go home first, thinking that Young would have more freedom to spend time with her friends and fiancé. Near the shop, Osu realized that the street held memories for him and Jong Tae, where they used to buy cotton candy at a small shop. In his imagination, it felt like they were kids again, and Young cried because Osu didn't give him cotton candy. Then, Osu eventually returned to the shop, picked up Young, and gave her an object that solved a puzzle. Young was very touched because Osu had managed to figure it out all this time. On that day, Young went to visit a river she used to go to with her late mother. At first, Osu didn't know about the river and tried to change the topic of conversation. But then he remembered that Jin-sung had once told him that Young's real brother's ashes were scattered in the same river. Young was incredibly happy and touched as she felt the wind and heard the sound of splashing water, which brought back memories of moments with her mother and brother. She got so caught up in the moment that she accidentally walked into the river and nearly drowned if Osu hadn't quickly rescued her. Osu's actions were just like what Young's brother used to do. He carried her to safety, and for the first time, Young touched the face of the man she thought she had lost long ago. Disappointed with Osu's behavior, Young went to the address listed on his business card. However, he found out that the luxurious house had been taken over by Moo Chol. It turned out that Moo Chol had seen Young-ho in the newspaper when he got engaged to the heiress of the PL group. Realizing that the man was suspicious about the two people named Osu, Moo Chol decided he had to protect his friend. So he made up a story and lied to the man, saying that the person in the middle of a photo was the real Osu, the owner of the PL group, while the one next to him was the fake Osu, who still owed him money. After Young-ho left, Moo Chol contacted Osu and told him that he just saved his life. He reminded Oh-soo once more that the debt had to be paid in just 2 months. That night, Young invited Oh-soo to stay at a private villa because she felt comfortable having her brother around. Oh-soo actually felt a bit awkward staying overnight with Young, but he agreed to fulfill her request, even if it was just to comfort her until she fell asleep. It was clear how much hope Young had for her brother, to always be by her side, especially since she was no longer herself due to the tumor in her head. Breathing in the night air and riding a motorbike made Young feel like she had found the happiness she had been searching for. She thought about her mother, and it's different with Oh-soo, who shed tears because he remembered the anniversary of his ex-girlfriend's death, while on the motorbike, and his ex-named was Hee-jo. At that time, Oh-soo had forgotten it was the anniversary because he had been busy all day with Young and drinking soju together. It turned out that both Jin-sung and Hee-soon, who was Hee-jo's sister, had prepared an event for him and tried to contact him several times, but he never answered. At that time, Young was very curious about Oh-soo's first love. So, Oh-soo finally told her about Hee-jo, the woman he loved at the age of 19 who was willing to leave her family to be with him, even though he was unemployed. The next day, Oh-soo received a call from Jin-sung, who asked him to go to a place that reminded him of Hee-jo. From the phone call, it was clear that Hee-soon was very disappointed in Oh-soo, as if she had forgotten her mistake that led to her sister's death. Oh-soo then asked Mrs. Wang to pick up Young because he needed to rush to Hee-jo's grave, the woman he still loved. Unintentionally, Oh-soo even raised his voice at Young because she was asking too many questions. When they arrived at Hee-jo's grave, Oh-soo unexpectedly met Moo-chol, who had also come to pay his respects. It turned out that when Hee-jo died, she was pregnant with Oh-soo's child, but he had rejected her at that time and intended to abandon her. Hee-jo, who didn't want to lose her lover, had chased after him on her motorbike and didn't realize that a truck was approaching her. This tragic incident was witnessed not only by Oh-soo but also by Moo-chol, who truly loved Hee-jo. After reminiscing about the incident, a fight broke out between them. Moo-chol regretted giving up Hee-jo to Oh-soo, who had ultimately abandoned her. Moo-chol was frustrated with Oh-soo's irresponsibility. He even gave Oh-soo a deadly capsule, saying that he could use it if he regretted his actions or if he wanted to eliminate Young to gain control of her wealth quickly. In another place, a lawyer presented Young with a modified will, where she requested that some of her assets be given to Oh-soo when she passes away, even though she knew her position was under threat because she only received a small share of the company. Mrs. Wang continued to act professionally at work. At that time, Young assigned her to find a man she had met at Oh-soo's apartment a year ago. When Oh-soo returned home, Young met with him and asked what had really happened because Oh-soo had suddenly changed his attitude towards her. There, she listened to Oh-soo's story about losing his lover and a medicine that could relieve the pain. Young felt that she really needed the capsule, so she pleaded with Oh-soo to give it to her. That night, Young couldn't sleep peacefully, so she asked Oh-soo to sleep with her. This strange request was initially rejected by Oh-soo because, even though they were brothers, it felt inappropriate as adults. Eventually, Oh-soo approached Young because he understood her loneliness since childhood and her struggles with insomnia. Young then asked Oh-soo for his opinion about her fiancé, who would soon become her husband. She also gave Oh-soo a will, which they exchanged for a promise, both related to the capsule. Meanwhile, at work, Moo-chol was facing pressure from Mr. Kim regarding Oh-soo's unpaid debt. The following day, he soon arrived at Young's place with strong emotions. Jin-sung, who was also staying there, was surprised when he soon entered the room and found Oh-soo sleeping in the same bed. Oh-soo explained to Mrs. Wang that his actions were like those of an older brother caring for his younger sibling. At that time, Mrs. Wang decided that Young should get married to Oh-soo before he left Korea in 2 months. Meanwhile, Jin-sung had to calm down Hee-soon, who was upset because Oh-soo had forgotten the anniversary of her sister's death, especially since she was starting to develop feelings for Oh-soo. Hee-soon had actually taken Young to a cafe and revealed to her that Oh-soo had come into her life for a specific purpose, even though she kept his true identity a secret. However, she also mentioned that Oh-soo was currently in significant debt and intended to deceive Young. A little later, Jin-sung arrived and quickly took Hee-soon away from the cafe. Oh-soo felt relieved that Hee-soon could control herself. After learning that Oh-soo needed a large sum of money, Young left him and went home alone. Oh-soo understood that Hee-soon's recklessness stemmed from jealousy and just wanted him to achieve his goal to get the money. Because Young was still curious about the man she had met a year ago, she asked Young-ho for help in finding out who her brother's best friend was, the one who had lived in a luxury apartment. The two of them then went to a cafe and ended up getting very drunk. It was clear that Young-ho didn't respond to Young's words because he was busy with messages from a woman he was having an affair with. That night, Young asked Oh-soo to pick her up. Oh-soo already knew about Young-ho's affair but hesitated to tell Young because he didn't want to hurt her. During the ride, Young seemed very disappointed because she felt surrounded by people she couldn't trust, which made her life feel meaningless. She suggested a way for Oh-soo to inherit her property immediately by suggesting he could engineer an accident to kill her on the spot. Seeing how unhappy Young's life was made Oh-soo feel guilty, and he couldn't continue deceiving her any longer. Upon arriving home, Jin-sung informed Oh-soo that he had found a safe hidden in Young's room behind some paintings. He urged Oh-soo to open the safe quickly and escape before their deception was discovered, especially since So-ra was tracking Oh-soo. The next day, when Young and Mrs. Wang were not at home, Oh-soo took the chance to open the safe. Unexpectedly, Young returned home early because she had canceled her appointment with Young-ho's family. Oh-soo didn't notice Young and Mrs. Wang's return until he was hiding behind the door. When Mrs. Wang took Young to rest, she discovered Oh-soo in the room. Strangely, Mrs. Wang actually helped Oh-soo leave without Young knowing. There, Oh-soo explained that he had entered Young's room to search for her diary, while suspecting Mrs. Wang's true identity and Young's actual illness and treatment. It turned out that Mrs. Wang already knew about Oh-soo's 7 billion debt, because Mi-ra had been spying on him. Mrs. Wang made an offer, suggesting she would give Oh-soo money if he left Young immediately. However, Oh-soo refused the offer, stating that Mrs. Wang had misjudged him. However, he didn't realize that Mrs. Wang had moved Young's safe to another location that day. Thinking their mission had failed, Jin-sung and he soon rushed from their hiding spot, planning to escape. Oh-soo informed them that they couldn't open the safe and instructed them not to contact him for a while. Upon hearing that, Jin-sung couldn't stop thinking about it and intended to ask Mrs. Wang directly about the situation. Oh-soo isn't tempted by the money because he doesn't want to get caught in Mrs. Wang's trap, which could involve the police. If he's posing as Young's fake brother, his plan is actually to use evidence of Young as a child to threaten Mrs. Wang, suggesting that she used Young's wealth as she pleased. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Wang and Oh-soo, Young is feeling unwell and searching for Oh-soo's capsule. That afternoon, Young's safe had been moved, possibly because Mr. Jung, who likes Mrs. Wang, was now affected. He tells Young that things aren't safe at home, even though he introduced Oh-soo into her life. Now, he's warning Young not to trust Oh-soo too much. At the same time, Young realizes that Mi-ra has only been pretending to be sincere with her, and that Mi-ra had been paid to spy on her. This revelation frustrates Young even more. During his free time, Oh-soo revisits old videos of Young in a mirror room. There he discovers that Young had intentionally not been treated and was kept locked up at home to feel lonely, believing that only Mrs. Wang mattered in his life. This revelation deeply moves Oh-soo, and he starts to think about how he must help save Young, who is now alone and in trouble. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wang is secretly planning to imprison Oh-soo if it's proven that he's a fraud. She's even gone as far as checking his fingerprints on a painting in Young's room because she's still curious about his true identity. Even if Oh-soo is indeed Young's brother, Mrs. Wang still wants to get rid of him because she sees him as a troublemaker. However, Mr. Jung is committed to fulfilling his promise to the late Mr. Oh and can't easily dispose of Oh-soo, even though his involvement was because of financial troubles. Back to Oh-soo and Young, Oh-soo realizes that the capsule is missing from his drawer. He tries to ask Young to return it, as he believes it's a dangerous object. There he persuades Young to seek a good treatment, despite the risk that this might expose his true identity. They plan a vacation with Jin-sung and Hee-soon, aiming to make Young happy by doing activities that blind people don't typically experience. It turns out that Young-ho is aware of So-ra's connection with Oh-soo and intentionally gets close to her to investigate Oh-soo's family background. He plans to invite So-ra to meet at a mall, coincidentally on the day when Young is buying a birthday gift for Oh-soo. In another location, Mook-hall finally meets So-ra and informs her that Oh-soo is pretending to be the heir of the PL group to pay off his debts. After this conversation, So-ra heads to the mall for a meeting with Young-ho. Suddenly, Young starts to experience a severe headache and nearly faints. Soon after, a waiter at the mall calls Oh-soo to come and pick her up. Unexpectedly, So-ra, who was on her way to meet Young-ho, witnesses this incident. Young is examined by a doctor and refuses further tests after regaining consciousness. There, Oh-soo provides some information about Young's condition, mentioning that she has a brain tumor. The doctor advises Oh-soo to take Young to a hospital with better facilities, but Young is hesitant due to the trauma from the previous incident. She wants to enjoy life while she still can and promises to go to the hospital if the pain returns. Meanwhile, Jin-seom and Hee-soon, who were instructed to monitor Young-ho, report that he was seen meeting with So-ra. As the brand ambassador for a product, Young-ho has apparently been investigating So-ra's life, including her romantic involvement with Oh-soo. However, during their conversation, So-ra expresses her strong affection for the PL Group heir and mentions that the man beside Oh-soo is deceased. At that moment, Young-ho decides to cancel their collaboration, fearing that So-ra's romantic relationship could harm the company's image. After returning from the mall, Jin-seom and Hee-soon catch Young-ho in a compromising situation with another woman. On the other hand, Oh-soo was at Young's house, and there was only 1 month left. There, Young made a special birthday bread for Oh-soo, which made him very happy because he hadn't felt loved or cared for by anyone since he was a child. Then he wanted to take Young on a dream cable car ride, but he couldn't get permission from Mrs. Wang. In that moment, Young felt happy with Oh-soo. However, Oh-soo wasn't sure if he was starting to truly love Young or if it was just a passing feeling. He wanted to kiss her as an adult, but he didn't. Then, Young introduced Oh-soo as her brother at a party in front of some important people. Soon after, Mrs. Wang invited So-ra to the event on purpose to see how Oh-soo would react. On the other hand, he soon began to feel the attention from Jin-seom. In the end, she considered that Jin-seom deserved her love, rather than having to be heartbroken because she liked Oh-soo. Meanwhile, 2 people are keeping an eye on Young-ho at a meeting. At that time, Mr. Jung found out from Jung-tae that Oh-soo is not a pizza restaurant chef, but a gambler in the Cheongdam-dong area. After the event, Young-ho told his people to follow So-ra and Oh-soo to see where they went. The next day, Oh-soo got tired of So-ra bothering him all the time, so he called a guy named Kim, who happened to be her boyfriend, and asked her to stop chasing him. Meanwhile, Young had to go home early because she needed to take some medicine. When Oh-soo found out, he got really worried because he thought the medicine might be dangerous, and he had it in his hand. Soon after, Oh-soo rushed to catch up with Young in her kitchen, holding the capsule and feeling anxious. He couldn't be sure if the medicine was actually harmful, but he decided to distract Young by spilling its contents under the table. At that time, Young noticed something was off because the capsule seemed empty, but she still swallowed it, confused about why Oh-soo threw away the medicine he said would make her feel better. A little while later, Oh-soo was startled by the doorbell ringing, and it turned out to be So-ra outside the fence. There he asked her to wait somewhere while he tried to calm Young down. Then he called Mi-ra and asked her to take care of Young for the night. When Oh-soo left, Young collected the scattered medicine from the floor and put it back in a small bottle. Once Mi-ra arrived, Young asked her to keep her condition a secret from Mrs. Wang, acting as if everything was okay. Mi-ra felt sorry for working as a spy for Mrs. Wang and lying to Mr. Jung about Young's illness. Deep down, Mi-ra genuinely cared for Young. She promised to always stay loyal to Young from that moment on. Meanwhile, Oh-soo bumped into So-ra somewhere. So-ra, deeply in love with Oh-soo, offered to help him pay off his debt if he left Young's house within 3 days. However, Oh-soo was hesitant to believe her because So-ra had deceived him before. In another place, Mr. Jung met a detective in the Cheongdam-dong area to ask about the gamblers there. It seemed that Oh-soo had bribed the detective to say that Oh-soo had changed this year and was rumored to be the heir to the PL Group. When Young arrived at Mrs. Wang's house, Mrs. Wang seemed worried about her condition. She became suspicious because Mi-ra had told her that Young had just eaten and taken medicine. But a servant revealed that Young hadn't eaten any of the porridge Mi-ra made. The next day, Young went to a friend who worked at a pharmaceutical company to check the medicine Oh-soo had given her. Young was shocked to discover that the drug was a dangerous poison that only certain people could access. One night, Hee-soon and Jin-seom gathered evidence of Young's affair with another woman when they spent the night at his house. At that time, Mrs. Wang started to become more open and asked Young and Oh-soo to undergo a DNA test. Even though she had already done tests with Oh-soo's personal belongings, Mrs. Wang felt that something was amiss. She also reminded Young that there would soon be an election for a new president. At that time, Young still believed that Oh-soo was her brother because he could recall all their past memories, which couldn't be fate. After learning about the dangerous drug, Young planned to meet Mu-chol using a business card given to her by Young-ho. They agreed to meet at Mu-chol's workplace, which happened to be a nightclub. Because Young was visually impaired, some troublemakers harassed her, trying to take her money and bother her. Fortunately, Oh-soo arrived and helped Young by getting rid of the people bothering her. When Osu arrived, Young actually expressed her frustration, especially when she remembered that the capsule he gave her was actually poison. After her anger began to calm down, Osu admitted that he had hit rock bottom and had planned to end his life with the capsule. Young was curious why Osu didn't give her the medicine, considering he could inherit all the assets if she were gone. This left her in a dilemma, trying to understand her brother's true character. After their conversation, Young left Osu. While holding back her sadness, she suddenly fell unconscious on the staircase. Osu, along with Jin Sung, rushed her to the best hospital in Korea. After examining the CT scan results, a doctor recommended immediate surgery because Young's brain tumor was growing. A female doctor named Dr. Jo also explained that Young's condition was not likely to improve, and there was no need to give false hope. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wang met with Sora to ask for an explanation about Osu's behavior from before he met Young. There, Mrs. Wang asked about Osu's friend with the same name. Sora revealed that the man had passed away in an accident a year ago and had lived in an orphanage. Mr. Jung and Mrs. Wang then visited Young in the hospital. They witnessed how well Osu took care of Young, showing his genuine love for her. The following day, Jin Sung starts to get worried because the deadline set by Mukal is getting closer. On top of that, the troublesome Sora is planning to reveal to Young's family that Osu is not her real brother. At that moment, Jin Sung advises Osu to quickly expose Young Ho's cheating scandal instead of dealing with Mrs. Wang's schemes. He believes that sooner or later, everyone will realize that Osu truly loves Young. When Osu disagrees with his suggestion, Jin Sung plans to confront Young Ho in his own way. During this time, they are suspicious of each other's intentions regarding Young. Osu tries to explain to Mr. Jung that Young had received treatment for her illness when she was young, but not for her blindness. This revelation deeply affects Mr. Jung, as he had believed that Mrs. Wang had cared for Young as if she were her own child. Back at the hospital, after hearing the doctor's explanation that there is little chance of her illness being cured, Young decides to go back home. However, Mrs. Wang insists on taking her to the regular doctor who has been treating Young. When Mrs. Wang returned home, she became emotional and shared her thoughts. She realized that Young might resent her and think she wanted to control the company. Mrs. Wang also tried to remind Young of all the sacrifices she had made, like helping her learn to read and stay in school, despite Young being blind. All of this was so that Young could eventually manage the company. It turns out they had been hesitant to operate on Young because she had always refused. Meanwhile, So-rae again warned Osu that staying in Young's house was very dangerous, as she could expose his true identity at any time. But Osu assured her that he would leave Young at the right moment. That night, Young discussed her upcoming wedding and the surgery that would happen soon. The following day, Mrs. Wang visited several orphanages, but she couldn't find accurate information throughout the day. The next day, Mr. Jung was really surprised when he saw an old picture of Jong Tae and Osu from when they were kids. In the picture, everyone could clearly see burn scars on Osu's left hand. It turns out that the doctor who seemed unfriendly the other day is actually the best surgeon in town and happens to be Muchol's sister. At that time, Osu didn't have any other choice, so he met with Muchol and even knelt down in front of him. He did this to try and persuade Muchol's sister to treat Young. But Muchol didn't respond to that request, and instead he got really upset with Osu's attitude because he was already frustrated with him. Even though Osu had to swallow his pride in front of Muchol, he was still disappointed because Young didn't have any hope for her recovery. That night, they argued until Osu stormed out of the house. Muchol chased after him, feeling like the situation was similar to something he went through many years ago. After a little while, Osu came back to pick up Young because he couldn't stand to see her crying. Osu took Young to a special place to make her realize how valuable life is and the challenges he would face if he lost her. After a long conversation, Young finally agreed to fight her illness and face whatever risks might come their way. The next day, Osu saw a snowman that Young had made in a note that said that she wants to live longer with him. From a distance, Mrs. Wang noticed that Osu had feelings for Young that were more than just brotherly. On the same day, she visited the orphanage where Osu had grown up and learned that he wasn't originally from Mr. O's family. Meanwhile, Mr. Jung found the original accident report about Young. Jong Tae was surprised to learn that Young had been with a stranger all this time, but they decided to keep this secret to help Young recover because she seemed very enthusiastic. Jin Sung faced disappointment when he realized that blackmailing Young-ho wasn't as easy as he thought. Young-ho admitted that Young and Mrs. Wang already knew about his affair. However, Oh-soo received some good news when Moo-chol called and said that Dr. Jo was willing to check Young's condition. However, Moo-chol's help came with a price though. He threatened Oh-soo, saying he'd harm him if Oh-soo couldn't pay back the debt within 19 days. But Oh-soo didn't care about that as long as he could save Young, who was innocent. He also promised to find other ways to make money. When Oh-soo returned home, Mrs. Wang told him that they had agreed to have Dr. Jo perform the operation on Young. However, she had plans to send Oh-soo away after Young's successful operation. While waiting for the surgery, Oh-soo took Young to various places and did many things together. Young felt that this was the happiest time in her life, where she could laugh freely and believe that life was truly fair. On the other hand, Mr. Kim told So-ra to go to Switzerland because he didn't want her to be close to Oh-soo again. He knew that So-ra was the one who took money from the nightclub, but he blamed Oh-soo for getting her attention all this time. However, So-ra, not wanting to lose Oh-soo, threatened Mr. Kim to leave Young within 3 days. She also asked Oh-soo to meet her at the airport and fly to Switzerland on a specific day. Soon after, Oh-soo met Jin-sung's parents, whom he considered his own parents. He told Jin-sung not to search for him anymore because Oh-soo wanted to solve this problem by himself. One night, Oh-soo couldn't hold back his feelings for Young and decided to kiss her while she was asleep. This made Young uncomfortable, but she pretended to be asleep. Oh-soo felt sorry because Dr. Jo said there was only a 10% chance of success for the surgery. That night, Mrs. Wang saw Oh-soo going to the greenhouse area. He wanted to record a video confessing that he wasn't Young's real brother and explaining why he did everything he did. He also left a photo of Young's real brother in the room, hoping that Young could see it if her eye surgery was successful. He said that Young's real brother was much better than him and was liked by many people. There, Oh-soo apologizes for loving Young in the wrong way. Jin-sung, frustrated because he wanted to help Oh-soo but didn't have the money, decided to borrow money from a gangster. However, Mr. Kim thought Jin-sung's efforts would be useless. He actually ordered his men to beat up Jin-sung until he collapsed. Witnessing this terrible act, Moo-chol tried to help Jin-sung and warned Mr. Kim that there was still time for Oh-soo to make things right. He explained that even though they were gangsters, they still followed certain ethical rules in their business dealings. Moo-chol promised to take matters into his own hands and harm Oh-soo if he broke their agreement. The next day, Young began to distance herself from Oh-soo. She refused to be touched and even asked him to leave her room. Mrs. Wang, despite knowing Oh-soo's true identity, continued to act as if everything was normal. After the planned operation, Mrs. Wang wanted Oh-soo to leave the house with nothing if he didn't want to face legal consequences. However, Oh-soo also threatened Mrs. Wang. Mrs. Wang was slowly hurting Young instead of protecting her. Curious about what Oh-soo was doing in the greenhouse, Mrs. Wang finally checked the CCTV camera because Oh-soo and Young had been going there at different times. In another part of the story, Young, who was busy running his company and launching a new fashion brand. Long story short, Young went back for another CT scan and had a face-to-face consultation with Dr. Jo. During this meeting, it seemed cynical to hope that the operation could cure her tumor and restore her sight. However, Dr. Jo's words didn't discourage Young cause she still insisted on going through with the surgery because she believed that even a small miracle could happen. Young wanted to live the way she had promised Oh-soo. On the same date, Dr. Jo and her team simulated the surgery, but they couldn't be too hopeful because Young's illness was already quite serious. A doctor explained that Young's blindness had resulted from a lack of treatment since childhood. Then, after visiting the hospital, Young met Hee-soon and confided in her about her conflicting feelings when she was near Oh-soo. However, Young wasn't sure if he truly liked her brother because Oh-soo ordered Jin-sung and Hee-soon to go to a rural area as the situation was becoming uncontrollable. Then Hee-soon told Jin-sung that Oh-soo could get money from Young because she was starting to develop feelings for him. However, this wasn't a reliable plan because Oh-soo would likely be targeted by Moo-chol first. A few days later, when the chance came, Mrs. Wang managed to take Young's greenhouse key, which led her to discover the secret room, also known as Young's late mother's room. She was surprised to find many childhood video recordings made by Young, which could reveal her actions during this time. The following day, Oh-soo went to an eye clinic, but the doctor refused to treat Young because he had been bribed. Since he couldn't get help from the doctor, Oh-soo followed him and confronted him in the middle of the street. On that same day, So-ra decided it was time for Oh-soo to leave Young's place. However, Oh-soo never showed up at the airport as expected. So-ra was determined to call Young and reveal Oh-soo's true identity as not her real brother. At that time, Young was shocked to hear this, especially when she learned that her actual brother had died a long time ago. After discovering the secret room, Mrs. Wang scolded Oh-soo for daring to kiss Young, and threatened to have him arrested once Young found out about all this. There, Mrs. Wang suspected that Oh-soo had taken Young's childhood memories from the secret room and pretended to be her brother to get money. Mrs. Wang finally confessed that she intentionally caused Young to go blind. Her mistake was significant considering how she had raised Young, and she had become very dependent on her. Then, Oh-soo mentioned that Mr. Jung would consult a doctor who had manipulated Young's disease diagnosis. Hearing that, Mrs. Money was shocked, especially because Mi-ra was willing to testify. What they didn't know was that Young overheard their argument, which only added to her trauma. In the end, Young became convinced that Oh-soo was not her real brother. At the same time, Oh-soo received a message from So-ra, informing him that she had revealed all her secrets. Jin-sung, who had been thinking about leaving the criminal world, invited Oh-soo to gamble and left Young behind. However, Oh-soo was still contemplating this decision. Unexpectedly, Mr. Jung ordered Mrs. Wang to leave Young's house immediately. He declared that he would take full responsibility for Young from now on and report all of Mrs. Wang's actions to the shareholders. However, Mr. Jung's anger toward Oh-soo didn't frighten Oh-soo, as he had promised to take care of Young until the end. Afterwards, Oh-soo decided to check Young's secret room, which was now in disarray. He was certain that Young must have been deeply disappointed upon discovering that she had been deceived for so long. Oh-soo then played a video made by Young and finally realized that she had feelings for him too. Meanwhile, Young was seen visiting a boutique to find the perfect wedding dress. As a way to repay Mrs. Wang for her kindness, Young wanted her to choose a suitable dress and have a photo shoot, like a child with her mother. On the other hand, he soon took a significant step. She met with Young and asked her to provide money for Oh-soo. She believed that if Young truly loved Oh-soo, she should help him out because Oh-soo's life was at stake if he couldn't get the money. A few days later, Young actually took Oh-soo to a place filled with memories of her parents. Unfortunately, since the location was deep in the forest, his car couldn't reach it, so he had to carry Young to their destination. Young's departure understandably caused a lot of worry for Mrs. Wang and Young-ho. On top of that, Young expressed her desire to end the engagement. It turned out that she wanted to not get in touch again with Oh-soo, who had stolen her money for 7.8 billion. She was curious about how far Oh-soo would have gone to deceive her if he had received the money. Her disappointment in Oh-soo was even greater than her sadness over her brother's death. Realizing that Young truly hated him, Oh-soo tried to console her and expressed his genuine love for her. Thinking that her business with Oh-soo was done, Young asked him to call Mr. Jung to come pick her up. However, Oh-soo insisted that they stay overnight and return to Seoul the next day. In reality, Young knew that she was blind and easily swayed by Oh-soo's words, but being with him made her happy, even if only for a short moment. The following day, Young informed Mr. Jung that he would be returning home that evening with Oh-soo. He also gave some instructions to Mr. Jung, as Oh-soo would be leaving next week. Surprisingly, Young wanted Mrs. Wang to pack her things as well. This news shocked Mrs. Wang and Young-ho. Oh-soo then took Young to the market, sharing stories about his tough life at the orphanage, which he said was sad but taught him many valuable life lessons. He wanted to bid farewell to Young in a positive way. Shortly afterward, Oh-soo received a message from Moo Chol, indicating that the deadline for debt repayment was almost come. At that moment, Moo Chol and two of his associates were seen having a meal at Jin Sung's parents' shop. Then, a man named Num-sik advised Moo Chol to eliminate Oh-soo soon to free himself from Mr. Kim's threat. He believed that Mr. Kim was too afraid to do the deed himself. When Moo Chol made rude remarks to his mother, Jin Sung didn't stay quiet. He threw Moo Chol out of the shop and warned him never to return to his family. Jin Sung then met with Mr. Kim and struck a deal. He and Oh-soo would repay the debt by gambling. Mr. Kim, driven by his strong dislike for Oh-soo, planned to deal with both Oh-soo and Moo Chol at the same time. On the other hand, when Mr. Jung got home, he prepared what Young wanted, a suitcase filled with money to give to Oh-soo. However, Oh-soo declined to take all the money and only accepted a portion of it. That same night, Oh-soo finally left the house and Young also called off her engagement with Young-ho and asked Mr. Jung to appoint a new president soon. Mr. Jung then took custody of Young, who had previously been under Mrs. Wang's care. Soon after, Young decided not to accuse Mrs. Wang of fraud and left her blind by bribing the doctor. Hearing that, Mrs. Wang tried to persuade Young that she had always treated her like her own child and was not involved in Mr. O's death. She explained that a year ago, Mr. O had refused cardiac resuscitation when the doctor had offered to help him. Regarding the alleged fraud of funds, Mrs. Wang had actually returned the money to the company after Young took over a year ago. Young eventually thanked Mrs. Wang for her past service, but expressed the desire not to see her again after the operation. In that moment, Mrs. Wang had to accept Young's decision. On that same night, Oh-soo met with Moo-chol to settle Jin Sung's debt, which meant that Moo-chol's business with Jin Sung was now over. He then asked about the 7 billion that Oh-soo hadn't brought yet, especially now that he had left Young's house. At that time, Moo-chol appeared to be in poor health due to an illness. Oh-soo, with the little money he had left, also gave Jin Sung's father some money to help him move to his hometown. The following day, Mrs. Wang went to a village where her parents lived. Before departing, she asked Mi-ra and Jong-tae to visit Young's house and keep her company until the operation. As it turned out, Mrs. Wang didn't return to her parents' place because they no longer expected her presence. She had rented a small place to live on her own. Realizing that Oh-soo had come back empty-handed, he soon felt very disappointed and planned to ask Young for the money. She was worried about Oh-soo's well-being without the money. Eventually, Oh-soo agreed to settle the debt through gambling. However, he wasn't sure it would be easy for Mr. Kim to let him go, even if he won the game. Then, Oh-soo asked Moo-chol to hide immediately, as Mr. Kim had started targeting him. After Oh-soo and Mrs. Wang left, Young felt incredibly lonely and spent time in the secret room. There, Mr. Jung mentioned to her that Oh-soo might actually have feelings for her, as he had refused to take the 7.8 billion Young had prepared. Feeling unprepared, Young decided to postpone the surgery, especially since she wanted Mr. Jung to handle a case first, given his role as a lawyer. That evening, he soon and Oh-soo went to a tavern to have a drink together. He soon regretted Oh-soo's choice to risk himself again at the gambling table. At that time, Oh-soo felt guilty about being a part of Young's life and realized he couldn't deceive her anymore. At one point, Oh-soo tried to contact Young, but received no response. On that day, Mr. Jung had to leave Young alone at home due to an urgent matter, but he promised to return the next day before Young's surgery. Oh-soo was curious about what was making Young so nervous and causing the delay in going to the hospital. At the same time, Moo-chol's subordinates were seen meeting with Dr. Jo to ask for medication, as Moo-chol's condition had worsened recently. However, Dr. Jo insisted that Moo-chol should come to her for proper treatment. While traveling to the city center, Oh-soo happened to spot Young among a group of blind people. He decided to follow Young discreetly and kept an eye on her until she returned home. At that time, the presence of a taxi trailing them made Mi-ra uneasy. She was surprised to see that Oh-soo was the man in the taxi. On the other hand, even when Moo-chol was being pressured to go to the hospital, he consistently refused. At that moment, he instructed his men to head home first. Unbeknownst to Moo-chol, these men had betrayed him and were now working under Mr. Kim. Just one day apart from Young, Mrs. Wang felt confused. She wants to write a letter to Young in Braille. She was delighted when Young called her, sounding concerned. It seemed that their long-time relationship had created a strong bond between Mrs. Wang and Young. And turns out Oh-soo's departure also left Young missing him. Soon after, she entered the room where Oh-soo used to sleep and reminisced about the moments they had shared, which had brought her comfort. Then tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that she had lost the person she loved once again. The following day, Mr. Jung checked on Young's condition over the phone, while Mi-ra helped Young pack his things for the hospital. During this time, Young remembered that Mi-ra had an important job interview she had always dreamed of. There, she asked Mi-ra if she could attend the interview first, as the operation was scheduled for the evening. Young also gave Mi-ra a gift as a token of their friendship throughout the years. Although her heart felt heavy, Mi-ra eventually left Young in the company of the household staff. Besides that, Jong-tae had to treat to his sick child. Once again, Young postponed the operation, and it seemed like she was planning something. Not only that, but two of her trusted people were asked to leave the house after Young assured them that she would be fine. Oh-soo began to worry and try to contact Young, but she ignored calls from Moo-chol, who was already in a critical condition and trying to endure the pain while taking medication. At the same time, Mr. Jung called multiple times, but Young never answered, causing him to worry during his journey. Later on, Young called Oh-soo to ask about news and confessed that she was already at the hospital. In that moment, he realized that Young had been lying. After knowing that, he rushed to Young's house because it seemed like she was saying goodbye. Unfortunately, there were no available taxis for him to take. Fortunately, Moo-chol suddenly appeared and handed him the car keys, noticing Osu's desperation. There, Osu promised to discuss his matters with Muchal once he confirmed that Young was safe. Muchal apologized to Osu and expressed hope that they would meet again under better circumstances. Osu was unaware of Muchal's illness. That same night, Mr. Kim's men arrived to kill Muchal. Shortly after, Jin Sung came across someone lying on the roadside, who turned out to be Muchal. He rushed Muchal to the hospital, but sadly, they couldn't save his life. When Osu arrived at Young's house, he found her unconscious in the bathroom with a cut on her hand. He immediately called Mr. Jung and Dr. Jo to save her life. After examining Young's condition and administering IV fluids, Dr. Jo spoke privately with Osu about Muchal's death, which had happened almost simultaneously. Despite being Muchal's sister, Dr. Jo appeared strong to face this reality. She seemed to accept that Muchal had to die due to his worsening cancer. The day before Muchal was to be cremated, Jin Sung and Hee Soon sadly said their goodbyes to him in the morgue. The following day, Jin Sung managed to capture Mr. Kim's men who had killed Muchal. They didn't plan to hand them over to the police, but wanted to deliver their own form of justice. Muchal's subordinates also warned Jin Sung to be cautious around Mr. Kim because he was very cunning. On the other hand, Mrs. Wang found happiness when she saw her parents living their retirement years joyfully. During this time, Mr. Jung met her and asked whether she had any intention of returning to Young if she desired it. The next day, Young eventually woke up and was deeply moved to find Osu had been by her bedside all night. Later, she went to a secret room and watched a video message from Osu containing a heartfelt confession of his feelings. The two of them promised to stay together and discuss their future together after her surgery. They didn't want to lose each other. That night, Osu asked Mrs. Wang for help to visit Young's house because he had some urgent matters to attend to. The following day, he returned home and was welcomed by a warm smile from Young. At that moment, Young once again savored the delicious food prepared by Mrs. Wang, which she had missed so much. On the other hand, Jin Sung's family decided to move back to their hometown as they prepared for his upcoming wedding with Hee Soon. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Jo was relieved to see Young in good spirits and fully committed to the upcoming surgery. Mrs. Wang expressed her regret and apologized for causing her suffering, and their relationship began to get better. Meanwhile, as the biggest gambling organizer in Korea, Mr. Kim gathered many gamblers for a high-stakes game. Osu was on the brink of losing everything, but Jin Sung joined him just in time. With a well-thought-out strategy, they managed to win the game. The group running the gambling operation saw this on CCTV and realized Osu's desire for safety after securing the money. Although he had hoped to accompany Young to the hospital that night, Osu faced a tragic reality when he was betrayed by someone close to him. Shockingly, Mr. Kim threatened to harm Jin Sung's family if he didn't comply with his orders. To protect his loved ones, Jin Sung was forced to harm Osu. With Young undergoing surgery at the hospital, Osu tragically met his end that night at a gambling den. 6 months later, Young's vision had improved, although it wasn't perfect. At that time, she continued to support blind communities by making donations. One day, while traveling along a road adorned with blooming flowers, Young hailed a taxi and spotted someone who resembled Osu. Following this person, Young eventually arrived at a cafe where Osu was working. It turned out that he eagerly awaited messages from Young, relayed through Mrs. Wang. For the first time, Young got to see Osu's face in person, a face that he had only imagined, and that turned out to be the handsome young man of his dreams. And that's how series ends. The moral lesson from this series is if need money fast, just start a fake blind sibling service and hope for the best. Maybe you'll end up getting the money and the girl.